Riddhi, Team Lajja, for having me here today. It is an honor to be here and to be sharing with the entire community of people who have joined in to listen to our session. In the last few days since the pandemic, there has been a lot of conversation about mental health, and I'm sure to some degree, people are also tired, even though they've received so much information. And today, I am therefore going to try and make this session a little more interesting by talking about hidden influences, share information that has not really spoken about, so that a lot of our viewers here can have gainful insights, can take away and action things. And I would really urge all our viewers today to listen carefully, because some of the issues that I'm going to talk about, we choose not really to talk about. It is often believed that mental health disorder is an adult disorder. What is not really known is that early life influences have a serious effect and predispose children to a lot of psychiatric troubles and mental health issues later in their adult lives. Like a wind that moves invisibly, cutting rocks, shaping them, so do these influences, both personal and collective, affect and shape our very psyche. Right from the moment of conception to the relationship that each one of us has with our parent, to the relationship that both our parents have with each other, and in turn, their relationship with their parent is what affects and determines our mental health. When I meet mothers who come to me desperately seeking for a solution to their adult child's addiction, their violent behavior, their rage, and their suicidal tendencies, my heart bleeds for those women. So many of these early influences that shape their children could have been avoided if only they had the knowledge of these influences and if they were aware of them. And yet, there may be people here in the community listening today who, despite having this knowledge, may feel that our circumstances limit us. And because of these limited circumstances, we don't have the power and the strength to stand up and fight against them. And to each of you women here today, I will urge you and say that in our Indian tradition, there are many goddesses that we can pray to. And these goddesses can awaken Shaktis in us. A goddess is actually a psychological force. And when we invoke them, when we contemplate upon them, we awaken their potential in us. That is how the Nari becomes the Narayani. The journey of all life begins at the very beginning, and so does the foundation of mental health. When conception occurs in a loving, mutually intimate situation, the child that is born thereof has a much greater advantage to better mental health than a child that is conceived through force. Now, you will observe in India that whenever we start a new project, we always make a lot of preparations, and we have a puja or a part that sets it off or that initiates the process in order to make it auspicious. And there is a reason for that. There are 4 aspects that puja or the part or the sanctification of that process addresses. The first is to purify all of these influences to make that process sattvic. The second aspect is to remove all negative influences that might be affecting that particular project. The third is to attract positive influences. And the fourth one is to increase the potential of that thing. So whether it is a Griha Pravesh, whether it is a foundation of a new house we are building, whether it is a marriage in our house, all of these very important steps in our life, we will always do the prayer, the preparation, and sanctify the process. And yet, is it not astonishing that when we are doing the most amazing, the most sacred act in our life, which is the creation of life, when we are sowing that seed of life, it is mostly done in an unconscious, unmindful way, probably through unbridled passion, or worse still, through force. Now, for a moment, let us just stop and see in terms of the vibrational environment, because the puja and the part is affecting the vibrational environment only. So in terms of the vibrational environment, what happens when there is forced conception, or whether its conception occurs out of a mutually disengaged partners, where there is not love, but there is only the act happening? What happens there? So from the man's perspective and his energy field, what we are getting is desire, lustful energies, maybe some aggression, maybe some violence. And from the woman's energy field, what we get is helplessness, feeling of not having a choice, not having a say in the matter, of being objectified, of being powerless. In the soil of these energies, we create new life. And this is the basic foundation and the plate on which the mental health of this new child that is going to come in is going to be imprinted. Nikki was born in a similar way. Her mother was still grieving the loss of a previous miscarriage. Her father used to be in a traveling job, and he had returned from one such trip that evening, completely unaware of his wife's emotional and mental state, and thinking it was his entitlement as the husband, he engaged in intimacy that night. Nikki was born from that interaction. When the mother was grieving, she was sad and actually disgusted with that engagement. From a very early age, Nikki was quiet, withdrawn, and depressive. In her early teens, Nikki developed eating disorders. And by the time she entered her late teens, she had attempted suicide twice. There was a study done in Prague where children born from unwanted pregnancies were monitored for a period of over 35 years. And what the scientists found was that these children, when they grew into adults, they required more frequent psychiatric intervention, they had poor mental health, and they had difficult and troubled sexual relationships with their partners. The lessons, I think, from these experiences are really clear. Firstly, you should have a baby only if you're feeling emotionally, psychologically, and financially ready to have one. If you're willing to give that child your time, your care, your attention, your psychological engagement. Parenting is a serious obligation. And unfortunately in India, many times we hear this narrative that if there is a troubled marriage, the elders will say, let them have a baby and the problem will be solved. And that is such an unfortunate suggestion, because we are burdening an unborn child with the responsibility of solving the parents' marital discord. Is it even possible? And that is not a reason to have a child. And there are other situations in which there is the fear of social optics. And people feel that, oh my God, they've been married for so many years. Log kya kahenge? Itne saal ho gaye, abhi tak bacha kyun nahi hua? And the couple conceives because of this kind of social pressure. Neither of these two reasons is good enough to have a child. The only reason you should have a baby and bring a new life into existence is because you are ready. You are ready to give that child your love, your affection, your time, and your care. And then you can promise that child great mental health. There is a second thing. Conception should be a really sacred process, like all of the other important initiatives in your life. And it must require preparation, prayerfulness, purity, sanctity, like we discussed earlier. It must be the result of a loving engagement between both partners. And for women who are listening into this today, both men and women who are on this show today, if you feel for some reason that you can't have this kind of open dialogue with this partner, if for some reason that transparency and trust does not exist, I would recommend that you invoke and pray to Goddess Parvati. Parvati, who is soft yet strong, loving yet equal, and derives strength to be able to have this conversation so that you can promise your to-be-born child strong mental health, and so that your opinion, your choices are valued and you have a say in the matter. The second influence I'd like to speak about today is prenatal stress and stress during pregnancy. The fetus listens to every single thought that crosses the mother's mind. It feels every single feeling that is felt in the mother's heart. Oftentimes, there are cases where pregnancy is accidental, where conception is mistimed, and the mother goes through a lot of personal dilemma, chaos about having or not having that baby. And I would urge women that please, if this is happening in your case, resolve that conflict within at the earliest possible, because your child is receiving all of your information. It is hearing everything, it is feeling everything, and it believes that it is unwanted. It believes that it is not loved, the mother is rejecting it, and this becomes the plate upon which its mental health then develops through life. I have had, in regression sessions that I've conducted with clients, so many people recall their womb memories with crystal clarity, where they remember conversations happening between their parents. They are aware which one of their parents wanted or did not want that particular child, or if they were conflicted. And it is astonishing how these womb memories lie in the subconscious mind and can be awakened, but they shape the mental health in future. Also, by the time the fetus is 3 weeks old, which is probably even before you get to know that you're pregnant, the brain is rapidly developing. And it is like a sponge absorbing all of the sensory inputs that the mother is experiencing. And therefore, it is quietly listening, feeling, hearing everything. And it is no wonder that our grandmothers said that if you're pregnant, you must be in a happy, harmonious environment. Divya's parents did not want her. Deepa suffered this problem because she heard this narrative. For some reason, unknown to her, her parents tried to abort the baby. They did not succeed. The pregnancy was full term, she was born. Well into her late 20s now, Deepa is overly anxious. She has trust issues in her relationships. She has panic attacks and suicidal tendencies. There was a study done in Finland where children born to mothers who were experiencing maternal stresses, they were tracked for 30 years. And they found that these children had a 10 times higher probability of developing personality disorders. They were more likely to go into addictions, into drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and they were more depressed. A similar study was done in the UK. And the children born from such stressed mothers were found to be a lot more delayed in their neurodevelopments. They were more anxious. They were more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, and they were distracted. And the learnings from this experience, therefore, for us, are that if you're pregnant, and if you're going through some of this confusion, which can be natural, please bring peace to your heart at the earliest possible. If you need help, if you need to speak to a doctor or a mental health counselor, if you need to speak to a trusted friend or somebody, resolve it, solve it easily before it impacts the mental health of your child. If you're going through some form of maternal stress in your environment, maybe it is stress with your in-laws, maybe it is stress because of some marital disturbance with your spouse, or that you have internal fears of your own. You're fearful about how your life may change. You may be fearful about the gender of the child, if there is a gender preference in the family, or you may be fearful about the delivery itself. Don't brush it under the carpet. Please reach out to a mental health specialist, discuss your fears, discuss your issues, resolve them. Because when mothers are stressed in pregnancies, the child is stressed. Also, if you have prenatal stress, you're more likely to suffer from postnatal stress. And thirdly, please ensure that you bond with the baby in the womb. Speak to the child every day. Tell the child how welcome it is. Tell the child it is deeply loved. And these conversations have a huge impact in creating a positive mental health in them. I remember when I was expecting my second child, and I had spent those 9 months in a very prayerful and peaceful environment. But there were the odd times when we would go for a film, and if there was a violent fight scene happening on screen, this baby of mine would start kicking furiously until I got up and I walked out of the cinema hall, and it happened with me on 3 occasions. And I became aware that even watching a violent scene on screen was creating disturbance to my unborn child. And therefore it becomes very important what we see, the media we watch also should be peaceful, should be calm, because it's having an effect on the child's mental health. If any one of those listening this talk is confused, is going through some trouble during their pregnancy, I would urge you to invoke and pray to Goddess Durga so that you can find the courage and the strength to overcome your internal fears, your complexities in the environment, and you can protect your child, you can protect your own mental health, and create harmony and enjoy a loving, peaceful, happy pregnancy. The third influence that I'd like to discuss today is emotional neglect and emotional abuse. Now, we all love our children, and I know that is a given. We all do our best to provide for them materially, to keep them safe, secure, give them the best food, the best things that we can. But that is not enough for good mental health. What is required in great measure is emotional engagement, psychological attunement, and social stimulation for them. There is a reason for this. Unlike a lot of other mammals, when a baby is born, a lot of that brain development occurs after the delivery of the baby. In other mammals, most of the full development occurs while the child is still in the womb, but in the human cases, it is different. So the first 6 or 7 years, the brain connections are still developing, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, which is the third brain, or what I'd like to call the part of our internal brain system that is the soothing brain, that is able to bring calm to our minds. That is missing. Those connections are still developing. And what this really means is that the baby, when a baby is stressed, it has no internal mechanism to be able to address that stress and soothe itself. There are some philosophies, old world philosophies, that would say that leave a baby to cry because it'll cry itself to sleep. Usko buri aadat mat dalo, usko baar baar uthao mat. But the fact of the matter is that a baby is crying because there is some internal stress. And the baby has no internal mechanism to be able to soothe that stress like us adult humans. And therefore, it relies entirely upon its caretakers to be able to soothe them. It needs the holding, the hugging, the being held to the breast, the tactile connection that makes it feel you're safe, you're okay, I'm there for you. That is so very, very important. Now, in certain situations, we find that that is not possible. One is either if the parents themselves have been brought up by their parents in a way where this kind of engaged connection was missing, and so they don't know how to do this, and they feel overwhelmed, and they can't understand why the child is crying, or they don't know how to provide that loving engagement to them. A second situation could be where the mother is ill, as in the case of postnatal depression, and therefore it is not able to provide that loving connection. And sometimes there is a third situation, which actually is even more worrisome, and it happens fairly frequently, I find, is when a child is a little older, maybe 3 years or 4 years of age, and the parent is unwell at that time, and a role reversal happens where the child starts parenting the parent in emotional ways. And then the child does not get those first 6 or 7 years to develop its brain connections the way it needs to happen, leading them to become wired for anxiety. And therefore, all the children who do not receive this kind of affection, holding, contact, they grow up into anxious adults. I'm reminded of the case of this boy, Alok, I will call him. His parents were both working. They had to work. And he was the only child. And so they had to leave him at a creche. For 6 years, Alok was at the creche. Now into his 30s, Alok has had a history of being enraged. He has severe anger issues. He has been volatile on certain occasions. And he suffers from schizophrenia. He has no memory whatsoever of those 6 years spent in the creche. And this is a natural response from the brain, that when we have difficult memories, the brain will just shut them down and move them into the unconscious or subconscious mind to protect you. So I can only imagine what that experience for that little child may have been in the creche, for him to have blocked out that memory. And all of his mental health issues are likely to stem from that. There is a second thing when I talk about emotional abuse now. And I'm not talking about any serious kind of abuse. I'm talking about the kind of abuse that happen in families like yours and mine, but we are unmindful about it. Emotional abuse is anything that is stated verbally and is a negative expression to the child. Now, you may all have known of or heard of relatives or situations or been in such a situation where some child in a family may be plump and people will label them or just tease them or call them Golu or Motu, or if somebody is dark complexion, they'll say Kali hai. These labels become sticky. They define the self-image of that child right into adulthood. They negatively affect the self-esteem of that child. Or there may be sarcastic comments made like, Hamara pappu to hamesha fail hota hai. And then everybody laughs. And that creates so much shame in the child. Or there may be constant criticism of finger pointing by a parent saying, इस बच्चे को तो मैथ्स 2+2 करना नहीं आता, ये जिंदगी में बिजनेस क्या करेगा? And then they're surprised. They forget about it. But they're surprised why the child grows into an adult who's never able to succeed in any family business. All of these labels or declarations which are negative, they are like codes that are programming the child's vulnerable, developing mind. And these programs are going to stay with them right through adulthoods. They're going to become the limiting belief systems of that child. And like a self-fulfilling prophecy, the child will become all of those negative things that you jokingly said to that child. And you weren't doing it consciously. You didn't do it to hurt the child. It was just a light-hearted moment, but it had a serious impact on the child. So it is very, very important that we understand what these declarations are doing to our child. And we must also understand that they're not mere declarations. Anything that is negative that is said to our child is like a curse, like a self-fulfilling prophecy that child is going to become this person. So only say to your child those things that you want him to become. I think it is very important to listen to our children as though they are honorable adults worthy of our respect. Never ridicule them. Never, ever ridicule them. And yet we are human. There'll be times when we are upset with something else and we take that anger out on our children. And at those times, it's so important for us to go back to the child immediately as soon as we become aware, to apologize to the child, explain to the child, I'm sorry, Mama was just very, very disturbed about something else. I didn't mean to do this to you. I am sorry. And that reaffirm, I love you and you are a wonderful child, so that the damage is not done. If you find this happening in your homes, I would urge you to pray to and invoke Goddess Lakshmi, so that you can fill your heart with the endless love, compassion, and affection for your children, and find the patience, the tolerance to be able to keep giving them endlessly, like a goddess, like a Narayani, who gives endlessly to her children. And now I'd like to talk about the fourth influence, which is childhood trauma. When I speak of trauma, I'm referring to three things in particular. The first one is beating children. And I'm not talking about any serious offenses. I'm not talking about, say, a drunk father who is regularly beating the child, because I know that those are extreme cases. I'm talking about our kind of families. Families where there is a conditioning or a belief that spare the rod and spoil the child. And there are enough parents who think that बच्चे को डिसिप्लिन करने के लिए कभी ना कभी थोड़ी सी मार देनी पड़ती है, एक आधा थप्पड़ चलता है. But I'd like you to know what happens when we do that. I recall the case of this little child, this beautiful boy. And his mother had a problem that he was scoring very poorly in his grades and was never able to focus on his studies. And when I was working with this child one day, um, he suddenly developed a very severe pain in his ear. And his face went completely red. And when I asked what was happening, he'd gone into a regressive memory and he said, "Mama maths पढ़ा रही है, मुझे कुछ समझ नहीं आ रहा है, जोर से थप्पड़ मारा मुझे, मेरा कान इतना दुख रहा है और मेरे अंदर सुन्न हो गया है सब कुछ." That state of shock continued. The trigger of the books and the study continued. Every time he looked at his books, he'd go blank. Now, the mother is not some evil witch. She's a mother like you and me. She's a good person. But it's just that sometimes we get so frustrated. We don't have the patience to teach the child, and we think the child is being bad. No, the child is not. The child probably needs to be taught in a different way or has some other problem that we need to address. So it's very important that we don't ever beat our children. There was another case where this lady I met, she was in her late 20s when I met her, and her parents had moved overseas. They were posted overseas. And you can imagine those must be a difficult situation because you have to work all day, and overseas you have to come back and you have to do all the housework yourself. And this mother was a very disciplinarian, meticulous mother. She was a perfectionist. So she gave very detailed instructions to the children before going to work every day. But when she'd come back in the evenings, if she didn't find the work done to her satisfaction, the kids would be beaten. And unfortunately, the kids were beaten almost every day. By the time this girl was 16, she ran away from home. And for the longest, she was toying with suicide. She had this obsessive need to commit suicide, to die. And so we must understand that beating is only going to make it more difficult for the child. It's going to make their mental health worse. And we must have a compassionate attitude towards our child if they are suffering with their education or their studies or not scoring well, and try and work with them. I have worked with some children who had learning disabilities, and from failing, just working with them over the years, they have scored. One of those children have just finished their CBSE Class 12 board exams with a fantastic 91%. And I cannot even tell you how happy that child success made me. But coming back to trauma, the second kind of trauma is sexual abuse. We don't like talking about it, but it happens in families like yours and mine. It happens to both young boys and girls. With boys, when they are left alone, with faithful male caretakers, or when they're sent off to hostels, they're bullied by their peers. With women, I'm really sad to say that the majority of women I meet have at one time or another either been sexually abused or have been physically violated in some manner. There was this girl who was in a joint family. She was sexually abused by her uncle. There were members of the family who knew it was happening repeatedly. They turned a blind eye. It went on for years. Today, that girl is severely schizophrenic, and she lives in a personal hell where time and again she relives that experience, and she has a feeling that different people are violating her. You can imagine the horror that she lives in. And the third, I just want to mention that in all of these cases, The violation happened with trusted relatives, trusted caretakers and helpers, friends, neighbors, religious heads, pundits, astrologers, Gurdwara parties. It is horrifying. And if possible, if your circumstances permit, I would really say if you can be with your children the first few years of their life when they are helpless, be around them to safeguard them and to protect them, that can really, really help those children from having mental health issues in their adulthood. Most of these matters are not spoken about. In most families, we don't even get to know this happened. We hear of it when they're trouble, when they've grown into adults and they have problems as adults, and then they're trying to deal with the demons in their mind, and that is when it emerges. And so much damage has already been done. But you know what's even more horrifying is when I hear stories where this kind of abuse is reported to important women in the families. And I've heard them say, ऐसा ही होता है, चुप रहो, भूल जाओ. And when I hear those stories, you can just imagine what happens to the goddess in me. I can feel my Kali arise at that point in time. There is the third trauma that arises from children witnessing domestic violence. When parents are fighting, disagreeing, loud voices, angry voices, when there is talk of leaving home, when there is talk of causing harm to each other, when there is threats about hurting each other, that child is terrorized. The people that he expects to be safeguarded and protected by have themselves turned into animals, fighting, disagreeing. They have no idea what those children go through. It is sheer terror for them. And there are serious impacts of these things. What we find is that it leads to rigid gender stereotyping, pointing towards male privilege, towards abuse, towards bullying and animal abuse and addictions. Boys tend to exhibit more externalizing behaviors. They act out, they become aggressive. Girls exhibit more internalizing behaviors. They become withdrawn, depressed. And as they grow into adults, boys become abusers. Girls become the victims. So if any of this is happening in your families, I would urge you to invoke the presence of Kali and to be able to find the courage to stand up for all of these things, to call it out, and to protect your children. Sometimes in joint families, it can become really complicated, but it needs to be done. And therefore, you can only do it if you first become fearless. I'd now like to talk about the fifth effect, which is bullying. So often, bullying goes unnoticed by the parents. They get to know it much, much later. And the reason for that is either the child doesn't report it. They don't report it because they feel, Papa, Mummy kahenge, tumhari galti thi. The child feels that the child will be blamed for it. Or because the parents are so absorbed in the stresses and struggles of their lives that they fail to notice the behavioral changes in the child. And in other cases, they may be just plain denial. There are also situations where even when the child reports the bullying, the parents may have a conditioning or a belief system. They tell their boys, उसने तुम्हें थप्पड़ मारा, तुम वापस उसे एक थप्पड़ मारो. They believe that this is how they man up. They believe they're making their children strong. And when the girls report it, the girls are told, you're being too sensitive. जिंदगी में बहुत कुछ तुमको सुनना पड़ेगा, आदत डाल लो. And you can't imagine what the child feels. Because the two people that this child relied upon, hoped to receive protection and understanding from, it has been denied from them. And so the child grows into an adult and develops self-harming tendencies, is more likely to go into addictions, more likely to be depressed, more likely to be suicidal, suffer from PTSD, because the impact of bullying, especially when it's happening in school and they go back to school day after day after day after day, they are going through this trauma repeatedly. And so it becomes really important that we watch for those little signs that are happening. Watch if your child is withdrawn. Watch if your child is depressed, anxious. Is he not engaging with family activities? Is he or she just staying away in their rooms? Do they not want to go to school? If they're very young children, is there repeated bedwetting happening? Is there isolation? Is there drop on grades? Keep a very, very close eye on your children. And if this is happening, if you sense this is happening, because obviously it'll have to be reported, there'll be another young child involved. It is not the other child's fault. It is probably the circumstantial environment in their families. And so you have to handle this matter very delicately. You need to invoke and be inspired by Goddess Saraswati so that you can develop and receive that power of discrimination to be able to find a very loving and compassionate resolution to this problem. After all, your child will have to keep going back to that school. And this other bully is likely to be there or in that same bus that the child is traveling in. And you can't turn one child against another child. But the important thing is finding the discrimination, finding a loving solution to the problem. So these are the 5 personally experienced influences. But I must also talk about the socio-cultural experiences, the influences there. In the last few years, scientists have discovered the effect of epigenetics, which really means that the emotional trauma, the mental trauma of our ancestors is passed down to future generations. What this means is that if your grandmother went through a traumatic incident and she didn't deal with it or solve for it, then you're going to be experiencing the trauma. You're going to be affected by it. And you may not even know why you're depressed. Everything may be perfect in your life, but that is the epigene traveling down, which has got activated in you. Now just think about the ancestral impact upon you. Think about all of the suffering, the silent suffering of your grandmothers in your ancestry. वो जो सब कुछ पी जाते थे चुपचाप, हमारे grandmothers. They never spoke about it. They just quietly drunk the poison of their pain that flows down like a river and it affects all of us. Think of all the hidden family secrets that you may never know of. Think of the female infanticides in all of those girl children that were aborted. In the Vedic tradition, they call this Pitradosha or Matridosha. But the fact of the matter is that science is discovering it today. These things affect the health, the mental health of future generations. And so anything that you and I don't deal with today, it's going to pass on to our children and our grandchildren, which is why it becomes really, really important that we deal with it, that we solve for it, our mental health issues. It's not wrong for us to be depressed. It's not wrong for us to reach out and take help from medical experts or from counselors. And then there is the impact of cultural conditioning. the effect of patriarchy on us, the effect of the misogynistic attitudes of the community that we may belong to. Think of all the honor killing of the women in the past from the regions that we come from. All of these things in the subconscious mind affect us, and they keep us blindly trapped in patriarchy. It's people like you and me who support patriarchy with our beliefs. We do not know about it because they are in the subconscious mind, but that's what the fear creates. And so it is so important for us to find these hidden beliefs in us. How can we find them? Well, see how they are enacted in our lives. Look in your own families. Are women respected, treated with equal honor, given the same sort of liberties as the men in the family? Look at your own children. Are you truly, can you put your hand over our heart and say that your sons and your daughters are endowed with similar opportunities, similar freedom, and similar education? It is so important that we actually raise our daughters as goddesses. Only then will they find the mental strength, the mental tenacity, the mental health to be able to fight the 4 social evils, the entrapments that lead them into depression and finally suicide. These 4 social entrapments are domestic violence, sexual abuse by the spouse, harassment by the in-laws, and dowry issues. And in order to be able to do that, we have to give our daughters 4 gifts. The first gift is we must give them safe space, psychologically, emotionally. We must give them our backs. Let them know we are always there for them. The second is great education. The third is the freedom to work so that they become self-reliant. And the fourth is the freedom to marry of their own choice. If we want to raise a whole generation of youngsters who are mentally strong, who are resilient, who are capable of bringing back the golden era, then it is important that we anchor ourselves in the goddess and we allow the potential of the Nari, of the Narayani, to emerge in us. And then we can learn to be a wife like Parvati, who is loving, but she is not weak or voiceless. To be a mother like Lakshmi, who can give her endless love, attention, support to her children. Be the teacher like Saraswati, who uses both the mind and the heart to bring prosperity to her children. And to be the protector like Durga, the fierce mother goddess, who will transform into several different avatars, depending on the circumstances, to protect her children. Dear viewers, remember always, Nari, tu hi Narayani. Thank you very much.
Wow, Suzy ma'am. I am truly speechless. And I'm sure looking at all the comments in the chat box, I am very sure that everyone is into deep, deep thought right now. And most of the male and females in the who are listening to us right now can relate to you. I can see lot many people look. People are writing your aura is mesmerizing. Wow, talk. Absolutely speechless, astounding. You're so profound. Look, people are actually talking of all the Devi Roops in you, Suzy ma'am. Hats off to you. But before I let you go,
Thank you.
I have a question asked by one of our viewer, and she just wanted to know. I think when you were talking about women during pregnancy and post that, she had a question: ki what we can do even before going to a mental health specialist.
I said that you need to pray to Goddess Durga. That's the first thing that you need to do. Because what that happens is when you pray and you contemplate on Durga Ma, you will find that she will awaken in you. She will protect you. She will give you the courage. She will give you all of the strength that you need to do. So just pray to her. That's the first step.
Wow, I so much agree. I mean, और कुछ मिनट आपका चलता तो sure I would have been more emotional, and I can't even talk. People have written so much that they have seen someone nearby facing such issues in their marriage or something like that. Yeah, and then they are writing even such mental issues happen with girls who are married late 30s. How much do you agree, ma'am?
Well, I don't, like I mentioned before in the talk, the
And
manifestation of the problem happens in the 30s. Let me explain this to you. हम बीज आज बोते हैं. The tree grows. It takes many years for a tree to grow and bear fruit. And then when it bears fruit, we eat the fruit and we say, फल कड़वा है, bitter fruit. वो डैमेज कब हुआ था? वो बचपन में डैमेज हुआ था. It's not that the girl has got married late and therefore she has a problem. The problem is not with the girl. The problem is with the hidden influences in her life. And that is what I'm saying. When the women, when I meet them and they come to me and they are at this age, that is when they have become aware of the demons in their life, because that is when they are acting out or playing out in their lives. And now they want to solve them. Now they want to slay those demons, and they started addressing it and dealing with it. पर वो problem तो बहुत साल पहले हुई थी. वो हादसा बहुत साल पहले हुआ था. That is why it's called a hidden influence.